Hello, everyone. I'm Vern Davis. Welcome to Plant Profits, and I'm your host of Plant Profits. And looking forward to this discussion. My guest today, in the last 6 months, he's been very busy to say the least. My next guest has over 30 years of experience building and restructuring multinational organizations around the world. With a strong emphasis in healthcare. Healthcare has been the common thing here. And I want you all to meet my guest. My guest is Peter Caldini, and Peter is the CEO of Acreage Holdings, and I know you've heard of those folks. And I'm welcoming Peter to the show. Peter, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Vern.
Yeah,
Excited
and I'm
to
not
be here.
kidding. Yeah, absolutely, man. And I'm not kidding. You have been busy as hell, and we're going to get into some of these amazing activities, man. But let's talk about it, though. You've been focused in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you did some schooling down, and you lived in Boston, got some schooling done, and in Italy, you got some schooling done. But you went into healthcare and had this amazing global career with Pfizer, right?
Yeah, Pfizer and also Bayer and Wyeth.
Yeah,
Which became Pfizer. Yeah.
which became Pfizer, right?
Yeah.
And you work globally. I mean, you
Right.
had responsibilities in many countries, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that has put you in position to even understand this thing called cannabis. And it looks like you really got into cannabis when you led Bespoke Capital, a fund, a SPAC that you put together, a $360 million business to invest in the cannabis companies and buy cannabis companies. What got you there? How did you go? Now, hey, healthcare, wellness makes sense. What else is to the connection of you going and leading these multinationals into this arena?
Yeah. So I listen, I think, a lot of those experiences, especially in the healthcare space. And when we talk about healthcare, and usually when you mention companies like Pfizer and Bayer, everybody thinks oncology and pharma and stuff like that. And I never worked on the pharma side. I was on the consumer side or over the counter type of products. So those are like the Advils, the Centrums. So they're more consumer packaged goods, but it's a little bit more regulated, right? So that was a good experience. And a lot of the global experience, Vern, was, I had a lot of experience working and building organizations in regulated markets, and a lot of experience doing turnarounds. And that's one of the reasons why the company always said, hey, Pete, we have a problem in China, and I understand you have a lot of experience in China. And I would say, not really, but whatever.
So you grab your fire hose and get on a plane and go over there.
On a plane. So what happens is in a multinational organization, and especially operating outside the U.S., there was always opportunities like that. And I had the experience, very hands-on, very kind of entrepreneurial in a corporate environment. And, that's where I got these responsibilities, and which I think was very, when you talk about operating a cannabis business in the U.S., a lot of my experiences outside the U.S. have been very relevant. So I have experience working in emerging markets. So I've worked in all the major emerging markets like Russia, China, Brazil. So I understand the fluctuation. I mean, that's kind of normal. The other thing is a lot of experience doing restructuring, and obviously the story of Acreage, that was a restructuring. So I had a lot of comfort in doing that, but also managing across multiple geographies, right? So when I was running Europe, it's very similar to running a cannabis business in the U.S., right? You have to be very
Let's talk
similar.
about that. Tell me that. Tell me how.
Well, you think about it. If you look at cannabis in the U.S., it's a state-by-state model. Each state has different regulations. Each state has different competitive set, consumer behavior. So it's a state-by-state model. Europe is the same way. When you're talking about consumer healthcare, it's like Germany's different than Italy, and
country by country.
It's country by country models. So as a leader, you have to do a couple things. One, you have to understand what is your portfolio strategy, meaning what are the states that you're really going to drive and prioritize and put the resources behind? What are the states that you're going to actually probably just maintain? And what are the states you have to make the tough decisions that you're going to exit or, sell that business? So so that's part of the portfolio strategy. And the second part is when it's a state-by-state model from an operating standpoint, you have to figure out what are you going to decentralize to have it state focus, and how much you're going to bring up to the center that provides the synergies, but you do lack a lot of the specific market responsibility. So
Peter, stop right there. And I don't mean to interrupt you. That right, what you just said, that has been driving MSOs crazy for a few years, right? I mean,
that's a few years.
Yeah.
Vern, it's like, I mean, but that's why a lot of the international experience really served me well, because I did run, Pfizer's OTC business in the US. And quite honestly, which was a little bit unpopular to say at Pfizer, I was like, this isn't that complicated.
Yeah,
right?
it's an easy job. Pete, I got an easy job here.
But you don't say that. So it really, so a lot of it to me is second nature. Operating an environment, it's a state-by-state model. So you do understand that there are challenges in terms of operating in that context. And I can understand why some of the MSOs struggle with it. For me, I've been doing it for a number of years. The challenge where I do have, even within Acreage, while I see, hey, this makes sense, it's how it works, sometimes the rest of the organization, isn't as accustomed. So it's a little bit more of a learning process for them. So that's the experience that kind of prepared me for it. And I think the question that you asked was, how did you get into the space? And how did you end up at like Acreage? And for me, great career at Pfizer, really enjoyed my time there. But the higher you go, the more kind of, I would say, political and bureaucratic it becomes. And
of course,
I'm very much an operator, and I had exposure, and I saw the opportunity in cannabis. Like a lot of people, I saw a huge commercial opportunity.
Right.
And not only in the US, but on a global basis. So that kind of got me interested in the space. And then I really started learning more about it. As a person, as a consumer, I always saw cannabis as probably a healthier alternative to alcohol on a recreational basis. But I didn't know, to be honest, I didn't know much about it. What really opened my eyes is when you start really looking into it, a lot of the health benefits that exist. And so I became, quite honestly, a believer in the power of the plant. I think there's a lot of positives to cannabis, and that got me really interested in the space. And as you said, we first started with a SPAC, and we did an IPO back in 2019. And wow, it could only be in federally legal space because we were on the TSX. So we looked at the Canadian operation. We didn't really see much opportunities there. So we ended up doing a qualifying transaction outside of cannabis. But then at that point, I got approached by Acreage, and, I saw it was a kind of a big mess, and, I like turnarounds. And
that's what you do, man.
Yeah.
This is what you do. Well, thanks for that background, because that really helps set up you for doing what you're doing now. So let's just get right into it. In October, the relationship with Canopy changed. Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, listen, we've always had a relationship with Canopy, going back to 2019. Yeah. When the initial agreement was made, and this is prior to May joining, where once it becomes federally permissible, there would be a transaction. Canopy would buy Acreage. It was amended in 2020, really driven because of the financial performance of Acreage. Okay. So that the agreement was revised. And I would say when I joined, really the beginning of 2021, we had a relationship in place with Canopy. And initially the focus was really about prioritizing and fixing the Acreage business, which we were able to do in 2021. And then during all that time, we were always working with Canopy saying, hey, how do we fully leverage the ecosystem? Yeah. Within the context of, hey, the regulatory environment, because federal legalization wasn't going to happen. So we were trying to figure out creative ways that we can bring this all together
And that Peter is what I want to talk. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, that's what I want you to dive into is how does 1 + 1 = 3 and what you're trying to get done here and the moves that you guys just recently made and the ones you made back in 21. So I think that's what's really important. I'm Vern Davis. I'm your host of Plant Profits. And my guest today is Mr. Peter Caldini. He is the CEO of Acreage Holdings. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Vern Davis. You listen to Plant Profits. I'm your host. My guest today is Mr. Peter Caldini. He is the CEO of Acreage Holdings. And Peter was just about to embark on this relationship and evolution of this relationship with Canopy. And Peter, how are you guys leveraging this, and what does that entail, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so, I think the first thing is, first of all, it was a long process to get to that point in October.
Yeah.
There was a lot of creativity. We collaborated very closely with Canopy in coming up with this structure.
Okay.
Because we recognized that the regulatory environment wasn't going to change. So how do we create a business model that can operate under the current regulatory environment? And that's where we created the concept of a special purpose vehicle, so like a legal entity in the US that Canopy had exchangeable shares, so they weren't directly involved in the business, but this new legal entity was able to trigger on our transaction and was also able to trigger on the transactions of Wana and Jetty. And also some other opportunities there. So, we anticipate, let me just tell you about the process for us to get to there. We have a shareholder vote, which we expect to happen at the beginning at some point in the first quarter, which would approve the sale or the transaction for our floating shares. We have 2 share classes. Canopy already has the option to trigger on the fixed shares. And then Canopy has to go through a shareholder vote to create a new class of shares called exchangeable shares. At that point, there'll be, once that's approved, and then they can start, triggering to bring this all together. And, the idea with this is really bring the power of these 3 organizations. So Acreage, Wana, and Jetty. To me, I think it's a tremendous opportunity to really accelerate growth. Because if you look at Wana, Wana is a market leader in gummies and edibles. Right?
It's amazing.
Great company. We can leverage their capabilities as opposed to Acreage, coming up with their own formulas or own gummies. So it's really leveraging their capabilities. We can actually then work together with Jetty and Wana as we go to specific retailers as a bigger bundle. They can leverage our infrastructure in the back end. So there's a lot of opportunities to fully leverage the capabilities across the different businesses and really operate as one powerhouse business.
Let's break that down. Because you have, and you said more than this, but there's at least 3 known important entities that make this group, right? Jetty, Wana, Acreage. And it sounds great behind the scenes. I come out of the adult beverage industry, and there's there's when you put these companies together, it really looks good in the boardroom. And then you have to meld them together, and there's got to be transformation and pieces that put in play to make it all 1 + 1 = 3 is what we talked about. So here's what people lose sight of and make big mistakes in my view. And I've seen a few trips around the sun, right? So is that this stuff sounds great. Oh, that theoretically this works. This is great. But the question I'm asking is, as a consumer, what do I see that is going to affect what I do with my pocketbook that's going to tell you, Peter, we did it right?
Yeah, listen, I think Vern, I think you're raising a good point. I would say
Yeah.
most M&As,
Right.
it's all about execution, right?
Yeah.
And that even goes, forget about cannabis and any type of industry. The biggest challenge is it looks great, like you said, in the boardroom, it looks great with the analysts, but it's how does this all come together? And it's always the executional element. And you always have that in big companies, which experienced professionals, never mind trying to do this in cannabis. So it's always an executional element.
Right.
In terms of a consumer, what they're going to see is if we do it right, is just more accessibility to the products, better distribution, a clarity in terms of our portfolio strategy. So we might have different options leveraging those capabilities, but it's going to be a lot more, accessibility of the products out there.
Okay.
Probably at better pricing from a standpoint as we'll have scale. And that's where you're going to see the difference. But I would actually say that the biggest impact you're going to see is more from an internal execution standpoint than actually the consumer. And that's where always the challenges are with any type of M&A.
Yeah. So how are you guys going to work together? How's the Wana leader and the Acreage leader and the Jetty leader, how does this coexist?
Yeah, well, so I think we're pretty early in that process, Vern, because we're not going to be, our part of it is not going to close till the end of the year or the beginning of next. So, so we continue to be an independent organization. So we have to be very careful as we go through this process. I still have to operate with the hat of Acreage.
Okay.
And it's still pretty early. And, we're having some initial conversations in terms of structure and how to operate.
Yeah.
And so, what I would say is there's a lot of time to get that sorted out. And there's sometimes a little bit danger spending too much time too early on and distracting your organization. So, we're trying to walk a fine balance. And a lot of these conversations, quite honestly, are driven by Canopy. But, I think to answer your question, I mean, I think what I've been very pleased with is, working with Nancy and working with, Ron is very successful entrepreneurs, but I think they also understand, how to bring this all together and where the opportunities are. But, to answer your question, I think a lot of those things still need to be sorted out. And, we have a good 10 months to do it.
So will you in the next 10 months, before it all closes, as you say, will you guys start to see and feel some of those opportunities come to bear?
I think we will try to do that when we have to be careful, because we do have our own, requirement specifics. We're an independent company, they're independent.
Yeah.
But there's always opportunities to have better collaboration, and that could lead to distribution opportunities, that could lead to, leveraging certain platforms and capabilities. But in terms of full integration, that wouldn't happen until it closes.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for that. That really helps. As you can tell, I had a lot of questions about what this thing is going to look like. And because I think it's very, very interesting and can be extremely successful. And I think that's awesome when consumers can have better choices, more of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Vern, if you look at this transaction, it's a lot different than some of the traditional transactions in the cannabis space, right? So most MSOs, they're operating, let's say, in 4 states, and then they acquire a company in another state, right? So that's a 5th state. So in essence, 1 + 1 really at max can only equal the cumulative, right? There's not a lot of synergies above it. And unfortunately, because the executional elements, a lot of times you're not getting the full benefit of that one incremental asset. In this case, because of the model, and it's, these are brands that are highly successful in their specific categories, there's a real opportunity to take 1 + 1 + 1 to equal 5.
Yeah.
As opposed to like 1 + 1, and then you just add another one. But it's also more complex to execute it.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Peter. Let's talk about the business.
Sure.
A little bit. Let's talk about, look, we were all waiting in December that, we're going to get that banking regulation reform. Didn't happen.
Right.
Where are we, Peter?
In terms from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, where do you see what's next? When does this become another topic that gets to the brink again?
That's a good question, Vern.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, we've tended to be disappointed more often than not. And I think there was a lot of positivity regarding SAFE. It was almost, the probability was quite high, and it turns out it didn't happen. So it's really, for me, it's hard to kind of judge, what's going to happen from a regulatory standpoint, especially at the federal level. And, quite honestly, and having operated in all these markets I've done in the past, there's one guarantee that has always happened. It never happens as quickly as you think it does.
Always. That's a constant. Yeah.
That's a constant. So as an operator, in my view, is I always look at it, how do I ensure success under the current regulatory environment?
Right.
Because when there is change, you're going to have plenty of time to adapt. And so that's really going to be our focus. It's historically always been our focus is let's focus on what the regulatory environment is today to make sure that we're successful. And that's at a federal level, that's at a state level, because when there is change, especially on the positive side, you generally have time to adapt.
Yeah.
So that's how we kind of look at it.
I think that's smart, because you can only control where you are. When
Exactly.
Where your feet are, you gotta own that. And the problem is, though, I talked to a lot of people in the last couple of weeks, and I just hope we don't have a hangover that's self-induced, right? If you think about it, nothing changed since December 29th or 30th or 31st, right? January 1st was the same.
Yeah, but I think one of the biggest differences, I think, without SAFE passing, I think it's created a really liquidity challenge for a lot of operators in the space.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the biggest change, because I think a number of, especially mid-tier, smaller operators saw that as a potential lifeline to continue to get, the sourcing. Now, a lot of the capital is dried up. I think many of the larger players like ourselves were pretty well, established, but I think it's going to have a consequence for the rest of the industry, which I think ultimately, unfortunately, lead to a weaning out of the industry.
No, I totally agree. Peter, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. I'm Vern Davis, and I am your host of Plant Profits. And Plant Profits is brought to you by Produce Global, my company. And today, my guest is Peter Caldini, and he is the CEO of Acreage Holdings. And we're having a terrific chat, and I look forward to coming back. Thanks. Hey, welcome back, everyone. I'm Vern Davis. I'm your host of Plant Profits, and Plant Profits is brought to you by Produce Global. My guest today, Peter Caldini, he is the CEO of Acreage Holdings. Peter, let's look at, this year, look at some of the challenges and opportunities, as you said, as you mentioned. Yeah, I think liquidity is an issue moving forward here, because unfortunately, some businesses were really put a lot of hope into something happening with the banking legislation, and it didn't happen. So here we are, and we're living, day to day here in that business. But if you look at the challenges, and I just look at this as a business, as two consumer product goods guys talking here, right? If I look at brands, okay, and I look at state to state, it's so difficult, right? You guys are in cultivation. You have a product in this state tastes different in this state, and right, and there's many elements to that, and just getting the forecast right of how much to have, how much inventory you got. It's the wine business on steroids, right? It's multiple strands that you got to have to be competitive in an outlet. It's very difficult. How are you dealing with that? Because as this thing evolves, you want that to evolve and become more consistent and dependable to the consumer. How do you do that?
Well, listen, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges in the industry, right? Because it is a state by state model, and most other industries, you have one manufacturing location that serves the entire United States, right? And
Advil is Advil, right?
Yeah, so it's pretty consistent, not only in the U.S. but in other countries as well.
Right.
And that is really the challenge, because in each state you have your own facility, and realistically, I mean, this is a plant, so there's not always consistency, and that's something that we've always, we want to be in the premium segment, high quality premium.
Right.
Not to say that we have the quality to match that in all the states, and that's really where our focus is. But I don't think you're always going to have the consistency, Vern. It's just the nature of the product and the nature of the model, but you need to be operating in that segment, and that's the segment where you make a decision. For us, we feel that that's where we need to be, and I think in a number of states we are operating in that segment. Okay. We believe we need to be in that because we're not going to be a scale player, right? Yeah. So we want to make sure that we have high quality products. We want to make sure we upgrade in the markets where we're not, but we continue to really pursue that as an operating business. The challenge is the consistency. I'm not sure. I think that's going to be very difficult. You probably can start achieving that more in, products outside of flower, but that's going to be processed products. You can try to get more consistency, but I would say
I agree.
How you do that's going to be different. And, the inputs are always going to be different, but that is the challenge for this industry. And so that's why for us, whatever we do, we try to stay in that segment. Yeah. As opposed to like, hey, let's harmonize this, from a taste and flavor and a strain profile, because it's not always going to be consistent.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that is the case. You have these consumers that travel and they have different expectations because they're not thinking about it like you are. Yeah. They're thinking about it the way a consumer would think about buying, like I said, a package of Advil. Yeah. And that makes it a difficult environment.
Yeah. And I think, one of the challenges that's happening today, and challenges is, I mean, to me, it's just normal. Yeah. Is it's all going to be about differentiation. When you talk about the branding and things like that, it's, if you look back a couple of years ago when the industry was growing at 80%, the reality is there weren't a lot of choices. There weren't a lot of, locations to go for the dispensaries. So, now you have to create differentiation between whether it's your retail location, your brand, and your product and what you're delivering. And that's, to me, is where it becomes traditional CPG. And it's about how you create that differentiation. And once again, one of the benefits of the Canopy USA structure is bringing in that capabilities of the Wana and Jetty that are best in class in their specific category. And we can leverage that in all our states and throughout our portfolio. And they can be on the cutting edge of innovation, but it is about differentiation now.
Yeah. The environment is different. You have these very mature markets, Peter, that are, it's got a lot of inventory. The price pressures are going down, right? That's the environment. Now the light is always these new markets, Connecticut opened up for business. New York is on the way, Maryland, there's excitement from that perspective. How are you dealing with that within the organization?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I said regarding portfolio strategy. I mean, we clearly highlight what are the priority markets for us, and a lot of times it's around regulatory change. For us, it was New Jersey. Yeah, we're off to a good, great place, and Connecticut opened up yesterday. We're one of the leaders from a retail standpoint, so we see that as a great opportunity. But it's really about prioritizing your internal resources regarding the markets where we see significant growth opportunities, which usually are driven by regulatory change. Yeah.
Where are you, and I talk to a lot of companies and a lot of leaders, and there's struggles in organizations about, talent. And I talk to, companies, several companies are really trying to professionalize their leaderships and, whatever that means. And I think we all have different definitions of that. And I get those calls, right? And Where are the talent gaps as you see that is probably consistent across everyone?
Talent gaps within an organization.
Yes. Yeah.
To me, I think that, and this is the tricky thing about operating in the US.
Okay.
Because a lot of the professionals come from, these big multinationals where what we talked about earlier, this is completely different operating in the US in cannabis than it is where they came from. And I honestly, I find that as somewhat of a risk. I think the profile you need to identify are the people that can operate in a little bit more entrepreneurial environment where you don't have big structure, people that can really operate in, across multiple geographies, understand, and one of the challenges too, it's not always a very professional organizations. If you think about, where cannabis was 10 years ago, a lot of the growers are, were doing it illegally. And then you hand them a form. Hey, this is the policy handbook. They're like, what are you talking about? So that's, to me, that's the biggest challenge, because you could have great experience from these, great multinationals in the US. It doesn't necessarily translate to cannabis in the US. And I think you really have to dig through. It's like, hey, you worked at a great company. What are those experiences that are more entrepreneurial, that maybe even worked outside the US, where you understand different markets, emerging markets? Can you understand the concept of centralization, decentralization, and how you optimize it? So I think that's the biggest challenge, so I'm a little bit sometimes like, he had a great background. It's like, but what does that mean? Can they really adapt to what it's required to do cannabis? And I think that's one of the reasons why I think the experience I had is, my whole career was not in the US, it was outside the US for the most part. And, you learn a lot of different skills doing it.
Well, I'm sure you look for that type of career as you look for talent. And the other thing that I learned, and I think all you said is so true. I think the other thing I learned is that you got to leave your ego.
Oh yeah,
somewhere else, because things change very quickly, and you just really can't fall in love with ideas.
Yeah, you definitely can't. You definitely can, and I think that's unfortunate sometimes. We try to be a very humble organization. I think at the end of the day, even when you look at some of the bigger players, I mean, it's not that big of a business compared to where I came from, right? So then don't act like it's a $20 billion company, because you're a $400 million business, and that's not that big, right? So I think as a leader, you have to be very approachable within your organization, because that does create a more entrepreneurial type of environment, more open, flow of communication. And, that's what people want to see. So I think the ego is one of the things that's probably surprised me the most in this industry. There's a lot of egos.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm not sure why.
It's not that big. Yeah, Peter, that's really good stuff. Let's talk about your thoughts about 23. Okay. What are some of let's start with Acreage. Let's start with your business. What are your goals? What are you trying to get accomplished this year?
Yeah, listen, I think there's a couple of things. One is, and you mentioned it earlier, I think there's a tremendous opportunity in Connecticut. As I mentioned, we're a market leader from a retail standpoint. We've opened up our first adult use dispensary. We expect another one to come online in the next couple of months. And then we also convert our third retail dispensary, and we're looking to add on to that, through our social equity partner. So I think we see a good opportunity in Connecticut.
Great.
We still see a lot of opportunities in New Jersey, although we're noticing that the market is starting to slow down, right? So that growth's not there, but we have 2 operating dispensaries we're very happy with. We should have our third one this year at a great location. We did some work. We weren't necessarily happy with our output from our Egg Harbor facility, and I think we made a lot of great progress to really meet that high quality. So that will continue to be a driver for us. Ohio is continue to be a big driver for us as a business. We're probably one of the leaders in that state. Continue to drive that, and they drive a lot of the innovation that we do have, and we try to make sure we get that throughout the network. And we also see an opportunity, really from a wholesale standpoint in Illinois. I think we're not because the market necessarily is growing, and it is growing. It's a sizable market. I don't think we got our fair share of the opportunity there, and that's going to be a big focus for us. So that's where our priorities are, and that's where I'm going to see a lot of the growth drivers. But we also acknowledge that this is going to be a very challenging year in the marketplace. There's continued more price compression. I think, unfortunately, a number of players are probably not going to make it, and that creates a certain market behavior when that's happening. So it's going to be a lot tougher market operating in 2023 than what we've experienced in the past.
Yeah, and everybody anticipates that. What about acquisition?
Yeah.
Well, what is that environment going to be like?
Well, listen, I mean, right now as Acreage, we're in that process of completing the transaction with Canopy USA, and for me, I think there's a lot of work to do just to bring that all together. So we have to be very careful, but a lot of that would be driven through that Canopy USA. But just to answer this, I think it's a lot of opportunities for M&A. And I think there's a lot of good opportunities because I think there's good assets out there that would benefit from being part of a larger organization. So I think there's going to be a lot of good opportunities. I would say that's not necessarily our priority right now as Acreage standalone, because we still have to complete our transaction with Canopy USA. But, as a part of that, I think there's a number of opportunities that would fit in, quite nicely with what we have.
Peter, that's great. And I really appreciate it. First time meeting you. And I really appreciate you're coming on to Plant Profits and sharing with us and the audience. And I'm wishing you, man, all the big success.
Thanks, Fern.
And
Thanks.
we need you to be successful. That's real important that you're successful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, it's great meeting you, great coming on, and it's a small industry, and let's continue to stay in touch.
Oh, we will. We definitely will. And I want to thank everyone for joining Plant Profits, and hopefully you really enjoyed our visit with Peter Caldini, CEO of Acreage Holdings. And I look for you guys to search for us, Plant Profits, cannabisradio.com, Apple, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. We're there on that platform. iHeart, Amazon Music, whatever. We are there. Look for us. And also, I want you to follow Produce Global, my company, through our social footprint and LinkedIn and Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everywhere. We're everywhere, and we're trying to be everywhere. And really learn about what we do in the talent space, how we build companies, and how we change people's lives. And that's what drives us at Produce Global. And that's produceglobal.com, PROTIS global.com. We'll talk to you next week. So until then, cheers, everyone.